Good evening, ladies and gents, and welcome to the Spare Room Podcast. My name is Brian Bauer. I'm going to be your host this evening. This is the spot where we're going to talk about all things addiction, recovery, personal development, worldview, current events, all with the goal of inspiring purpose through hope, which means hearing other people's experiences. That means that sometimes you'll get to hear some of my personal lived experience, my recovery journey, my worldviews, and sometimes you'll get to hear from a guest, drop some knowledge and wisdom and their lived experience on us as well, all with the ultimate goal of making each other better, making our communities better, one topic at a time. With that said, let's just hop right into it today. You know, I have been involved in business and running my business and running a nonprofit for the last several years. I've had an interest in entrepreneurship and business for a long time, so I have a general understanding of like profit margins and incentives and client retention and how to staff properly and all of these different like nuances to running business that make it profitable and successful, right? And all of those things are necessary when you are going about operating and running a business. Now, let's imagine this. Think about this. Say that you're the one running a business. And in your business, the customers are legally forbidden from leaving. So you have a captive audience. The government is constitutionally mandated to buy your product. And failure, as if one of your clients is technically a failure within your system, that's actually a win and a benefit to your quarterly earnings report. Sounds like a too good to be true scenario, right? A fail-safe, if you will, when it comes to business. Now, if you hadn't guessed it already, what I'm referring to is our wonderful Department of Corrections in the United States. Now, since the 1980s, we're going to talk about the last 40 to 50 years. The Department of Corrections hasn't really been about correcting. For those of you that have been there, probably would agree with that statement. Now, I know that there's going to be someone that comes out of the woodworks on this. Like, no, I did this class and I got my GED and great. I get it that there are programs available and things that are available today in prison systems. They haven't always been available, but there's probably more available today than there have been in the past. Yes, those things are available and they don't have to do with the overall macro level point that I'm going to make today. So let's just clear that up on the front end before I get any of that pushback on this, because I don't want you to really miss the point of this, which is that the Department of Corrections is a $100 billion a year wealth transfer machine. That's what we're looking at, $100 billion a year. Now we need to look at, to be able to understand where we are today, we need to look at how we got there and what the history of it is. That's why I say 40 to 50 year context. So that means we need to go back to 1976. We're going to go back to bell bottoms, disco, Corvettes. I don't know what else. I wasn't born yet in 76. Still another 8 years before I was on the scene, but that's what I know to be true of the 70s. Either way, 1976. What was the prison system at in the 1970s and before? Well, there wasn't a standard. Here's the thing. There wasn't a standard of healthcare. Nobody was in charge of healthcare within the prison system. It was just it was kind of run amok. It was a Wild West way of running it. There wasn't really a mandated system of healthcare involved with that, right? It was a kind of an internalized thing within the state to run the healthcare that was happening in prisons. Now, at the time in the 70s, then a human rights groups started to get involved in that and state that it was constitutionally unethical, or it was against the Eighth Amendment in the Constitution, which has to do with cruel and unusual punishment, that there wasn't health care provided to prisoners within the system. And that's where this 1976 case of Estelle versus Gamble came into play, right? So the Supreme Court in that decision ruled that, quote, deliberate indifference to serious medical needs violates the Eighth Amendment. The result being, for the first time, the prisoners then had a constitutional right to receive medical care, which is, let's think about that for a second. That's weird. The prisoners in 1976 had a constitutional right to receive medical care, but we don't have it today for people outside of the prison system. So we have to get private insurance, or we have to get Medicaid, or don't have it at all. Weird. That's a topic probably for another day, but yeah, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that was a thing. Actually, what is that, 76? That's 50 years ago now. It was a thing that prisoners were mandated for it. So, in terms of human rights, seems like a good idea, right? It seems at least like a fair idea that there needed to be a system in place to provide health care to people that were in prison. Now, there was a backdoor deal on this. Now, I don't have a smoking gun to say that there was a conspiracy here, but if you connect the dots that I'm connecting, you can be the judge for yourself. Because there isn't smoking gun evidence, but there is to say that there is potentially some nefarious stuff going on because of these things. So Big Pharma was not involved in the prison system prior to this. But what they saw in this deal was that if the state had to start providing prisoners with health care, there was going to need to be pharmaceutical drugs involved. So Big Pharma stepped up and they said that we will provide those for all of this mandated healthcare services that you have in all of the prisons throughout the United States. And they just happened to be prepared and ready to make that jump at the time. Weird that they were just sitting around one day and then they were just ready to make this jump. But okay, I can take that for whatever it is. It happened. At the same time, these pharmaceutical lobbyists created what was called ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. And what this did was establish bulk purchasing and rebates. So drug companies were then offered rebates by private contractors if they use specific brands of antipsychotics, antidepressants, and this created really like a kickback loop, right, for the state systems when it came to getting pharmaceutical companies involved. The other piece of this is that because pharmaceutical companies that came in were mandated to be there under that constitutional amendment, they could set their price point at whatever they wanted. Now, if you're running a business, normally price point is based on the demand for a product. Supply and demand economics 101. Except pharmaceutical companies came in, there was no regulation on that. So they were able to set their price point at whatever they wanted, and the state legally had to pay it because they had to under that constitutional amendment. Now, they were guaranteed a customer base and they were guaranteed a price point, right? They weren't going to, if they increased their prices, they weren't going to lose customers, in other words. Now, we need to look at what else happened during this period of time, right? So they have a client, they have a customer base, they have a price point, they're ready to go. They are, the states are on board with it. The rebates are coming through. Everybody's making money. It's a good thing for all of them involved, right? 1980s come along. What happened in the 1980s? Reaganomics. What happened also with Reaganomics was the war on drugs, this war on an inanimate object, right? Because drugs themselves were the problem, right? This inanimate object was the problem. What did this lead to? Well, this led to policy changes such as the 100-to-1 policy. What was that? The 100-to-1 policy is the crack versus powder cocaine policy that was targeted on specific zip codes and demographics within the United States. Typically happen to be Black or Latino communities, but that can be a podcast for an entire other day. What is the policy, though? Well, it means that the sentencing for crack as compared to powder cocaine was 100-to-1, meaning that if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, it was the same. You got the same sentence as having to have 500 grams of powder cocaine. If you know anything about crack cocaine and powder cocaine, they're the exact same thing. Crack cocaine is just formed into rock form with powder or with baking soda and baking powder and water and cocaine. So you just add those things together, you cook it up. If you don't know anything about the drug trade, that's what we're looking at here. And powder cocaine is just in the powder form. Same drug, different form, 100-to-1 different sentencing. And this came along with the 3-strike policy. So we started targeting, the U.S. government started targeting these low-income urban neighborhoods with these policies. And what do you think that did to the prison system? Well, let's look at the numbers. It went from roughly 330,000 to over 2.3 million over the next about less than 20 years. Now, all these state-funded, all the prisons, like I said earlier, were state-funded prison facilities. So what do you think that they had to do? Well, they weren't able to just go put up more. They couldn't just go build more state-funded prisons. Because what does it require to put in a state-funded prison? It requires the backing of your local community. It requires the backing of your state because the state has to fund, the tax dollars have to fund the building of a new prison system. So the people have to vote for it. That takes time, and then the money has to get there, and that takes time. In the meantime, there's just starting to arrest mass amounts of people under these new policies and start to fill up all these beds very quickly, and that led to overcrowding. And so now there's pressure on the states, there's pressure on the governors, there's pressure on the whole system to do something about this overcrowding problem that they're having, which led to developing private prisons. Now, like say, Bill Smith comes in, he can build private prisons. Instead of building a Starbucks, he's just like, I'm in the prison business. And so instead of putting up a coffee shop, he puts up a prison. Now, if you're doing it as a private business and not the state, what is your motivation at that point? Well, your motivation is to make money because you're a business. Your business then is humans. Humans are your business. Humans in cages are your business, and the state is going to be supplying those for you, and you're going to need to be funding it. So how do you do that? You get the states on board with funding a certain amount of occupancy per beds, right? So you come to an agreement with the state where you have say, what was it, 80 to 90, I have it in here somewhere, probably 80 to 90%, I believe it's 90% rate on your occupancy on beds. And then you also make it a requirement, or not a requirement, kind of a requirement, but a contractual guideline that 90% of your beds have to remain full, or you're going to be sent to fine. So these private prisons were able to either fine the state for the empty beds, or the state was going to have to come up with filling the beds. How were they filling the beds? They were filling the beds through the tough on crime policies that the governors and everybody else was able to promote, and the war on drugs policies that they were able to promote, to be able to get these people off the street that were getting busted for crack and other drugs as nonviolent criminals, and start to fill those beds. So there are just mass arrests and long-term sentences of people to fill these privatized beds. Why was it great to have these as the prisoners? Because they were nonviolent offenders, typically. So they were drug users. They weren't really there for violent offenses necessarily, unless there was a violent offense that had it and the drugs were involved at the time. But really, they were nonviolent offenders, which means that there was basically, when you come to the people being your product per se, right? That's what the people are your profit in this scenario. They were a high profit margin. The people that you were arresting were a high profit margin product. They didn't require a lot of maintenance, and the maintenance that they did require was just being hopped up on the drugs that the pharmaceutical company was supplying. And so as a maintenance, part of a maintenance program, so they were relatively low maintenance, and they just took up space, and you were to build a state, and you were to build the pharmaceutical companies for these individuals. So you're making all kinds of money over the top. You're taking away from the money that they would be making in society, right? Because each per of these people that got arrested in the 80s lost an average of $500,000 over the course of their lifetime that they would be contributing as a contributing member, tax-paying member of society in the long term. But that money then shifted to the pockets of the people running the privatized prison system. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, at the same time, what else was going on at that time? Mental institutions were closing. There's a lot of ethical things going on with mental institutions at the time. And so where did these people go? Right? Somewhere. So where'd they end up going? They ended up going to jails. Or if they got released and they were back out into the general public, they usually ended up getting arrested for some type of crimes and then ending up in the jail system anyway. So the jail system and the prison system took on the mental health population as well. And then they were able to validate the use of a lot of these pharmaceutical drugs by taking in this population, because they could say a certain percentage of their people had mental health problems and disorders, and that's why they needed to be prescribing these drugs to the inmates in the prison system. You see how this starts to cycle through. They got rid of the treatment programs, and they just started locking people up in mass amounts for profit. So you have these pharmaceutical companies, and we'll get into a couple of those as well. And you have what's also called like a medical, what would you call medical contractors. One of these companies is known as correctional medical services, right, is what they provide. And so this is the connection between the pharmaceutical companies and the prison, and they are like this contracted intermediary that facilitates all of these type of things. So this is how they were able to contract for the bulk purchasing agreements, for setting up the rebates, for basically turning pharmaceutical companies into, instead of being something that works with the doctors on and establishing cures and these type of things, they basically became the, what would you call them, like a facility manager of the prison system based on the drugs that they are prescribing. Now, at the time, a couple of the big pharmaceutical companies that were involved in this was Eli Lilly and Janssen. And so they saw this happening, right? These are a couple of the big pharma companies that saw the shift in what was happening in the landscape of big pharma getting involved in relationship with the prison system, and they started to shift their marketing. So they started to shift they were previously really interested in hospitals, right? Hitting like, firms, that seems like a pretty obvious one, right? Big pharma companies, their relationship was mainly within hospitals because you had a large amount of people constantly going through, and they were able to do it that way. What they saw here was a isolated population that they had access to, and they could set those price points. So Eli Lilly and Janssen were a couple of these first ones that were able to hop in on this, and they saw it. So what they would do was, instead of going to the medical doctors that were involved in running the prison systems or like involved in the specific prisons, they would kind of bypass or step over or whatever when they would go to talk to these prisons, and they would talk to the wardens, and they would go in, like Eli Lilly would go in and they would say, I can see that, I can see that you're understaffed. I can see that you're stressed out. I can see that you're bleeding, your budget is bleeding. I can see that your facility is over capacity. Let me help you out. I got a plan for you. And Eli Lilly called this the 5x5. It was a 5x5 campaign, and that came out later because they ended up getting busted for it, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the 5x5 campaign was that if Eli Lilly prescribed, what's the drug that they were prescribing, the big one, Zyprexa, right? So it's an antipsychotic, or Seroquel, at 5 p.m., they would basically zombify their inmate population. They would like create a docile community, and they were able to manage the facility better that way. So if they were able to overly medicate at least 30% of the population, the private prisons were able to decrease their staff by about 20%. So they weren't having to pay additional staff to work on these overnight shifts, as long as they overly medicated their people by 5 p.m. that night, and everybody could work in 9 to 5, and they could only have a few people. They could have less staff overnight, which allowed the private prisons to maintain more money and more income. They ended up getting busted for this because it's illegal. So they ended up having to pay a fine. I believe it was like they had to settle a $1.4 billion lawsuit of this in like 2009. But $1.4 billion still didn't take them out, which means that they were making a ton of money. If you can settle a lawsuit for $1.4 billion and walk away from it unscathed. So that's why he got into the lawsuit of this, of realizing that it's illegal to do things that way, and they eventually ended up getting caught with it, but it wasn't they just actually made a shift in the way that they were handling it, and not an overall change to the system. Now, what other things were going on at this time? You start to see where these schemes started to take place in different sectors. So you said that the prison system was taking this stance on it, and it led to other crimes being found out all over the place too. There was the scheme in Pennsylvania called Cash for Kids. This one is really crazy, right? What they did is they shut down juvenile detention centers, and they made private facilities where they were being tough on crime for kids. And so these kids were starting to get arrested for minor things, like cussing out their principal or talking crap about their principal on MySpace. This is back in the MySpace days. And these kids were getting sentenced. So ended up being a deal with the facilities and the judges in that town in Pennsylvania to send these kids to these facilities and supply them with basically like the human capital, if you will. It ended up being found out that there was a $2.6 million judicial kickback scheme where this facility was funding money back to the judicial system in Pennsylvania. The only reason that got caught was because it was smaller and on a local level, and it had to do with kids. Well, when you look at that scheme and then you look at the prison system, it's like, well, the exact same thing's happening, but on a much bigger scale and did do with the federal government, and then nobody says anything. So that's kind of strange. Anyway, moving on today. So where are we at in terms of the pharmaceuticals today? Well, so we were talking about these different pharmaceutical drugs that were antipsychotic or antidepressant, these type of things. So what did places shift into after the antipsychotics and antidepressants? What's the big one today? Well, the big one today is Suboxone. Now, I want to do multiple episodes on MAT treatments, medicated assisted treatments, and I want to get some guests on here for that, and I want to go into a much deeper dive on that. But for today, we're going to stay on topic with this, and we're going to stay on the surface level, but we're just going to pull out the facts of the influence of what Suboxone has been since the Eli Lilly days and the overprescription of antipsychotics and antidepressants. In 2013, Suboxone was a $1.55 billion a year product. Now, the prison system, the same way that they did with the Eli Lilly products, the antipsychotics and antidepressants, decided or found out that they could use this drug as a behavior control method and profit off of it astonishingly. So here's what led to another investigation and another settlement with Suboxone in, I don't see what year it was, but this led to something else. So here's the deal. The Suboxone in 2013, patent on Suboxone tablets was expiring. Indivor, which was the manufacturer of Suboxone, switched to the film strips, generic versions of it also in a pill form. Okay, I need to back this up because I don't know that everybody that's listening even knows what Suboxone is. So Suboxone is a medicated assisted treatment that helps people deal with opiate-related withdrawal symptoms. And it is a medicated assisted treatment that people can be on for, ideally, short-term withdrawals to come off of, say, fentanyl, heroin, other opiate addictions, and be able to have an easier withdrawal period to eventually get off of opiates altogether. You can, though, on the other hand, take these things, Suboxone, in pill or strip form for extended periods of time, and they call that the medicated assisted treatment, long-term management, if that's what you want to call it. That's what I mean. We'll get into that at a later period, at a later date also. But at this point in time, in 2013, the pill patent was expiring, so they decided to switch to the strips. Now, the deception of this was that Indivor claimed that the film was safer to prevent accidental pediatric ingestion, so kids finding the pills or whatever and accidentally taking them. But investigations and a $1.4 billion DOJ, Department of Justice settlement, proved that this was a product hop just to block generic prescriptions. The financial yield of this, switching to the film, they allowed them to keep their prices 400% higher than generics, right? So since the DOC is legally required to provide the standard of care, guess who was stuck with the bill? The taxpayers. So taxpayers are funding this product hop to allow the pharmaceutical companies to set whatever price they want on these film strips that aren't even necessary for all the people in there. You say, what do you mean they're not necessary for all the people in there? Well, they're not just prescribing them to people with opiate addiction problems. Like I said before, part of this is behavior control. Now, I'm not saying that I know all the statistics on who's being overprescribed this. I know from my personal experience and some from nurses that I know that have worked in the prison system specifically, they use these Suboxone film strips to zombify and behaviorally control inmates in the same way that they did before. A couple of things that this has created is a black market for these drugs, because on Suboxone you can still get high. If you're somebody that's not an opiate addict and you take these, you can get high. So there is a black market for Suboxone strips and or pills, but specifically strips within the Department of Corrections system. Say, well, now, what else is there? There's shots, there's Vivitrol shots, there's other monthly shots that people can get to be able to mitigate the withdrawal effects and the long-term need for these opiate withdrawal management tools and products, where people can just get these shots once a month and it'll have the exact same effect as taking these things on the daily. So you say, well, why would they need to take these strips daily? Why would they need to take these strips daily if they could just take a once a month shot? Well, remember how I said the prices were 400% higher than generics? That's the reason. They're mandated to order more supplies of the strips than they are of the shots, which makes the pharmaceutical companies more money. I'm saying from my personal conversations with people that have been boots on the ground in the prison system, they have gone from strips to the shots back to the strips. And that only makes sense if they realize that they weren't making enough profit off the shots as on the strips. Now, that's just me connecting the dots. Maybe it's a conspiracy. Maybe it's just following the freaking money. So you can be the judge on that for yourself. But this also is creating a tether system for when the people get out. Now, this goes into a much deeper dive later on down the road, like I said, about medication treatments and Suboxone in particular. But now people that are coming through the prison system who may not have been opiate addicts are now tethered to the system because when they get out, they have prescription for these that continues to follow them beyond the walls of the prison system, which gets us into the other things. So each person that comes through the prison system is now hooked on that. What else do they get hooked on? Well, they're going to have to go to a halfway house. What happens when you go to the halfway house? Well, they're going to have to be on an ankle monitor, or they're going to have to show up to these classes. Now, let's be clear. There's 27 or 28 states now that still have privatized prisons. A lot of states have gotten rid of them, so this is still a thing occurring today. This isn't like a rare occurrence thing. Now, once they get out, a lot of these prison systems have charged people money to be incarcerated. So they're coming out of a privatized prison in debt to the prison for their stay, for being incarcerated for drug use, and now they're hooked on pharmaceutical drugs, and now they owe the system money, and now they're coming out without the life skills or anything else necessary to be able to have a fully functioning life outside of the prison system, because what the prison system did in these privatized areas was get rid of vocational rehab. So it means job training systems, mental health, counselors, therapists, groups, all these other things. They had gotten rid of a lot of these in these scenarios, so people get out hooked on a different drug, without the life skills, without the money, and in debt. What's going to most likely happen? Going back to the very beginning of this episode, who is the best client and for you? A returning customer. There's no motivation at this point, if you have a privatized prison, to not have repeat customers. Repeat customers are the foundation of your business at that point, which is what this is. And then you can keep them on. The pharmaceutical companies happy because now they might have just got a customer for life when it comes to drugs like Suboxone. When they say like, oh, just go meet with your primary care doctor or psychiatrist, and they're just going to continue to prescribe this laundry list of pharmaceuticals that you got put on to keep you zombified while you were in prison that you probably didn't even need to be on in the first place. That's the level that we're looking at. Now, if we follow the money, let's just follow the money here for a second, okay? We're going to go on the value of an inmate, and we're going to break that down. So the private housing, we're going to talk about privatized prison. Private housing, basically rent for your cell, $25,000 to $45,000 a year. Pharmaceuticals, mat treatment, and psych treatments, right? So any psychiatric meds or things like Suboxone, $5,000 to $12,000 a year. Phone and commissary services, $3,000 to $5,000 a year per person. Now, how Big Pharma uses rebate agreements with State Department of Corrections. So that means if a state agrees to make a brand name drug like the Suboxone films an exclusive option on their formulary, the company gives the state a kickback, which prevents the use of cheaper generics. So there is no reason for these pharmaceutical companies not to be heavily involved in promoting specific drugs that are going to yield them the highest amounts of return. Let's look at a few states. I want to give you some examples so you understand exactly what's happening now and what states this is happening in, so you can get an overall idea. First of all, Florida is the highest recipient state. The GEO Group, headquartered in Boca Raton, has poured over $4.1 million into Florida campaigns. $4.1 million to elect politicians who support the privatized prisons, who bring in more money to the pharmaceutical companies by keeping the system afloat there. Texas. What do we know about Texas? It's on the border. We have had a lot of back and forth and all kinds of stuff about the border, whether you agree or disagree. Insignificant to this statement is what's happening with the prison systems in Texas. The GEO Group, like I just said, in Florida, and CoreCivic have both flooded Texas elections with massive PAC campaign funding to ensure the border of crisis remains a high-revenue detention business. That means that people that are arrested illegally at the border are prime candidates for going into privatized prisons there, or if they're committing crimes at the border and they are being locked up there, they are all still money-making machines for that border state. Tennessee, which is home to CoreCivic's headquarters. State leaders receive significant backing to ensure that they don't move towards pro bono or state-run management. They are pushing back fiercely against state-run mandates because they are making a ton of money off of running it privately. The lobbying powerhouse. These companies don't just lobby for prison management, they lobby for harsher sentencing laws, and so they can, what does that allow them to do then? Ensures the steady flow of clients, right? So they're lobbying for specific politicians who are going to have their back by busting people for all of these drug-related crimes because they're easy ones to control, easy ones to get on the pharmaceutical drugs, and easy ones to continue to go back through the system because they're addicted to the drugs that allow them to get arrested again repeatedly. So that is how the cycle works. The lobbying money then goes to the politicians who gain power, influence, all the things that politicians want in those states, and that's how they're funded. So this goes to the funding campaigns of these politicians, not ever to getting anybody better. That is the returning client incentive for these programs. The occupancy guarantees I talked about a little bit already, the 90% occupancy clauses. So in these states that have the privatized prisons, the agreement typically is 90% occupancy clauses. So if a state successfully rehabilitates people, that means that the prison population is going to drop, which means that the private prison, the private company is going to charge a penalty fee or some kind of, basically we'll call it a penalty fee to the state, a fine to the state, because this is where this is crazy. They're charging a fine to the state because people are actually getting out and getting better and being productive, contributing members of society and not going back to prison. So because they're not coming back, it's a bad thing for the prison system, so they're going to fine the state. So if you're the state, then what motivation is there for people to actually get better in these states? There isn't. Now we're finally starting to, in a lot of these states, we're finally starting to actually make some headway on this. But if you think 27 or 28 states, whatever that is, in the country right now are still operating that way, what motivation is there for them to not do it that way, if that's their business model, right? So what does this mean? This means that the system maintains a 60 to 70% recidivism rate, which equals the billions and billions of dollars that continue to flow through the private ownership, through the pharmaceutical companies, and the other service providers and vendors that are all involved and have their hand in the bucket in the system. Okay, so I think you can understand and grasp at this point what that cycle looks like, right? What this repeating cycle looks like and what the motivation is. Now, why does this seem, now we talk about billions of dollars, big pharma, we talk about state-run, we talk about politicians, all these things. And to me, when I think about this, it seems like a daunting, it seems like an impossible task, right? It seems like an impossible task to try and take on big pharma, to take on the prison system, to take on the DOC, to take on all of these things. It seems like once something grows to that big, it's impossible from a grassroots perspective to change it at all. And a lot of that is, there's a lot of good amount of validity to that, but it's not as impossible as people think. It just seems that way. There's still people and companies and organizations that are running it. They're just people, and they're running these things, and they've been running it that way for so long that nobody questions what they're doing. And if they question it, they have enough money to shut them down. But there are ways to start resolving this. So we need to why does change seem impossible? We need to say, why does it seem impossible? That they're supposed to be regulating, right? The shield of privacy, private contractors often claim that their contracts are trade secrets. Oh, yep. So private contractors, so this is how they're getting away from the Freedom of Information Act. And we're going to go into that in a second. The Freedom of Information Act is important in all of this, but if they're private contractors, they don't fall under that. The state falls under the Freedom of Information Act, but the private contractors don't. So private contractors are calling these trade secrets because they are an independently owned business, and that shields them from the act and any accountability from these requests. All right. So what can be done? Despite the daunting power of the lobby, here are the specific levers that we can pull to start disrupting the cycle. Number one, the public opinion on pharmaceuticals. The California model, this is where the state is exploring the manufacturing of its own insulin and Suboxone, which cuts out the middleman. So if the state is manufacturing the product, then it cuts out the pharmaceutical company, which can drop the prices on all of these things and get rid of the product hopping. Decoupling beds from profit, so ending the occupancy guarantees. So no more 90% occupancy guarantees on beds. If we remove the financial penalty for the open beds, then we remove the incentive to keep the prisons full. That has to be a thing that gets mandated. Medicaid reentry and reform. This means that ensuring when an inmate is released, they transition to community-based care rather than the high-cost privatized shadow system. So like the halfway houses that play into this, I get that there can be a need for some of that, but there has to be additional other opportunities for people to go into community-based care instead of going straight there, or instead of just getting released to the street. There has to be a process for that to start decreasing the recidivism rate. Here is the call to action. There's a toolkit. But let's start talking solution here. I want to talk some solution because we want to get into what can you actually do at a grassroots level to start making a difference within your community. It's going to take a lot of paperwork. I don't know who loves doing paperwork. I hate doing paperwork, but the paperwork aspect of this is going to be a necessary element for it. You don't need to go write your congressman. You can start this on a local level, and like I was just saying, the Freedom of Information Act request is the best place to start. So you ask, here's how this works, and I'll drop the actual guidelines for this in the comments of where I post this on the YouTube channel. I'll put it in the exclusive. You're going to look for a diagnostic creep. This means not a creep of a person, but like a creep as in the creeping percentages, right? This means that if there's more than 20% of the population is on behavior management drugs like Seroquel or Zyprexa, you get to ask them why. Is it for treatment, or is it being used as what we've been talking about is basically like a chemical straitjacket for people to keep them under behavioral control? Then you want to audit the kickbacks. Look for the finder's fees or the consulting fees that are being paid to local officials by the private healthcare contractors with companies such as Horizon or WellPath. Those are some of the most well-known ones. Finder's fees and consulting fees. You want to they're not gonna call it a kickback, right? You got to look for the way that they're wording it. They're not going to call it a kickback. By filing this and by showing up to you can also show up to your local sheriff's budget meeting. Local sheriffs will have budget meetings and questioning the exclusive drug contracts in your county. You start to pull the curtain back on this, right? The more people that start to question it, the more that you start to pull the curtain back. The reason that it's continued to go on is like everybody's looked at it as, oh, it's the Department of Corrections. Like, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And all it takes, and we start to see this in other places, and this is, part of the reason of doing this podcast and going in depth on this, is pulling back the curtain on these things, starting to expose it to the light, starting to be the light that's in the darkness and realizing what's happening here. Because once you start to see the math on this, right, the $35 a day ankle monitors, the 400% price hikes, the judges that are getting rich off of the human misery is no longer needing to be the system. It's a racket. It's a racket that we have the ability to change, and it's reached a breaking point, and it has to be the people, like anything else, that step up and recognize it. Like you see, like what's his face, Nick Shirley did in Minnesota. Like, it's so, like, the fraud there is so blatantly obvious, and the fraud here is so blatantly obvious, and the amount of tax dollars is so blatantly obvious, and just nobody has said anything about it. So it's like, what motivation is for them at the federal and state level to change the way that anything's ever been done if nobody even complains about it? If enough people start voicing an opinion on it, that's how stuff starts to change. And it requires one town, one city, one person just taking the time to go through it and do it, right? The reason of me starting to do this is really just like getting the ball rolling. Like I said, I'm running businesses, I run a nonprofit, I'm doing all this other stuff. The podcast of this is a platform for me to tell you what I start to see along the way, because this is our population of people. So I do a lot of research within this on just a daily basis. And then I start to pull the thread on these things, and these things start to open up, right? So that's what I'm realizing here. The lobbying loop. So look for local officials that receive campaign donations from the same companies that they just awarded contracts to. Any system that leaves where an inmate is more in debt than when they arrived. People should not be leaving jails and prisons in debt to the system or tied to them financially. It's hard enough for an average person to afford the cost of living just about anywhere today without having to pay these absurd amounts of money to be tethered to a system on both pharmaceutical drugs and these other, like, nickel and diming people right back into that when they're saying, like, oh, then you have a missed UA and now you're right back in the system. Or there's so many ways to violate that when you're a non-violent drug using offender that all you're trying to do is get a hand up and not a hand out to try and get everything back in order. And these parts of the system are set up for you to be able to fail. And it's easy to say that, and it's another thing to pull these actual numbers out, pull out the Freedom of Information Act agreements, pull these things out, and actually start to expose that statement as being true. So that's where we're at with that. Here's the good news. We want to look at some good news here after giving you some ways to go about changing the system. When people are able to get out of the system to break the cycle, the 4-to-1 return ratio. That means that for every dollar spent on rehab, society saves over $4 in future costs. Now, what's really cool is that within my organization, my nonprofit, we just did a social return on investment thing as well. And we found that people that are coming through our program who are set up with peer recovery coaches who get into sober living houses, who have a structured program and some advocacy support for them within that first year that they're out and released, are actually, over the course of 10 years, that $1 is equaling a $6.61 return, which is a 660% increase. And over 20 years, it's 1,100%. And over 30 years, it's 1,400%. That's accounting for inflation and all kinds of stuff. I can give you guys all the links for all of that so you can see where specifically our data comes from on this. But I want to tell you that on the back end of this, when people are able to get into treatment and rehabilitation programs and community-based services and housing, it actually is way more beneficial to society than they would be contributing as to the GDP of the society as a incarcerated person, right? There's so much money on that side, and including now they have the ability to add that other $500,000, that $500,000 that would have been missing income in their life to the rest of their lifetime. And we're just talking about a single person, right? We're not talking about millions of people. So you can multiply that by millions of people, and you can really start to see the impact that this has on societies overall, and you can start to see how will impact our communities as it moves forward. There are a couple of the other things on here, the direct incarceration savings. So now we're going to be saving $38,000 per year per person for the imprisonment. The reduced pressure on police, court systems, parole, probation officers, saving an additional $4,500 annually per person. The tax revenue generation. So every employed former prisoner contributes to the economy in terms of now that they have a job and they're being self-sufficient and they're supporting themselves and their families through income and sales tax. So the example of this would be that connecting 100, just 100 people alone to jobs can generate $2.7 million in combined wage and sales over the course of their lifetime. That's just for 100 people, right? That is just for, think about the 100 people in your local jail. Now multiply that throughout the United States and see what we're able to do from a grassroots level. This isn't just about this population. This is about what can be the contributing factor to our society as a whole when we start to shift this around. When we start to, instead of putting billions of dollars in the pockets of people that have no interest in bettering our society, and we instead take that out of the pockets of politicians and pharmaceutical companies, and we put that back into our local economies and local society in terms of local taxes, in terms of income, in terms of people being producing self-sufficient members of society. What does that actually generate? And we're saying here, 100 people can generate $2.7 million over the course of their lifetime. Reduce victim costs. Lowering recidivism also reduces tangible losses. That means property damage, intangible costs, pain, suffering, productivity. So we're looking at if people aren't going back to jail and prison, they're not causing all this other damage to society as a whole as well. Now, let's just throw some more numbers at it because I want to really make this from a macro level what this impact is. Lifetime earnings. 100 employed individuals can earn a total of $55 million. Community savings, 1,500 fewer recidivisms can save $26 million annually. The data identifies specific factors that determine whether this positive ROI is achieved. Employment and job training. The most critical driver for moving individuals from public dependence to self-sufficiency. We need to address the homelessness. This is a major hurdle. This is what we are working on right now as well as the employment and job training is that formerly incarcerated individuals are 10 times more likely to be homeless than the general public. A lot of that comes from they can't qualify for an apartment on their own. So we need to go through this process of getting them into sober living houses, into other types of transitional housing, and giving them the ability to start going through the process of figuring out where they can live that is going to overlook or take into account whatever their felony record is and give them the opportunities available. And then we need to start looking at what affordable housing looks like and developing affordable housing complexes that are open to this demographic of people, because otherwise they do become homeless. And once they're homeless, the odds of them going back to jail and prison increases dramatically as well, right? Marginalized and fixed savings. So even if a prison doesn't close, the marginal savings on food, medical care, clothing per inmate still represent a high ROI. And so people not going back through the system still is a large social return on investment overall in general. And we start to decrease the demand and the strain on the system. And as soon as we start to do that, the system overall benefits as a whole. And these are the things that are happening that if you really think about it from this perspective, it's just like we're taking society at face value this is just the way things have always been. So unless something is like in our face dramatically affecting our current way of life, we just start to accept that that's the way it is and we don't do anything to change it. It's like all the tax dollars that go to these things, all the money that goes to big pharma, all of these rebates that we never see the money of, all the money that's flowing to politicians that we do or don't agree with. Whether we agree with them or not, they shouldn't be getting that kind of money from tax-paying citizens unless they decide to. right? So the money that's flowing into politics, the money that's flowing into big pharma, the money that's flowing into all of the aspects that deal with the recidivism rates of this, and all of the social programs that are spread so thin because they can't handle the magnitude of what's happening. This has been the outcome of what started 40 or 50 years ago. So we are trying to reverse something that's like multiple generations old. Now, people think that because we live in this AI generation and this instant gratification world and all these things, that we can come up with some policy and some way of doing things this year or in the next 5 years that's going to completely transform everything. That's not the way this works. It took 40 or 50 years to get to this point where it seems impossible to change the system, and it's going to take that same amount of time to reverse it. Now, we might be able to go faster because of technology, but when it comes to the culture and what people understand and what people know, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how intelligent or how much local people care to realize like this is one of those places that your tax money is going. Like you can't necessarily say like, oh, I understand how my tax money goes to the overseas stuff, which it does too. But like if you look at your local taxes, when you go to the grocery store and it's your local sales tax, all of these things that are your local taxes, this directly impacts your pocketbook. So whether you want to get involved in it or not is insignificant to the point that it impacts you. It impacts you and you just take it and don't do anything about it or don't question it or don't care. And that's fine too, but let it make known like that's a choice. When you see these things about the cost of living going up and the cost of living and the cost, this is one of those things that goes into that cost and people just aren't really paying attention to it. So with that said, hopefully this has brought some light to all you guys today. I'm going to need to take the pup for a walk because he is getting antsy that he's been sitting here with me for an hour going over this. I didn't know if that was going to go that long, and it looks like it did. So that's all I got for you guys for today. Hopefully you got something out of it. Feel free to like, comment, share, subscribe. Let me know what you guys feel about this topic. Hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully it made sense. If it was just gibberish, that's cool too. Let me know that. If you want to expand on any topics in the future, let me know that as well. And I will see you guys for the next one. Love you all. Have a great night. Tell me,